Okay, Ramani, we're going to have quite a conversation. I'm so happy that you're here. My gosh, you're just making a huge, huge difference in the world. And I'm thrilled that we can share you with our wonderful podcast audience. Let me just give a little bit of your bio. Dr. Ramani Durvasula is on a mission to demystify and dismantle the toxic influence of narcissism on all of our lives. She's a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at California State University, LA, the author of Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist, and You Are Why You Eat, Change Your Food Attitude, Change Your Life, and lots of other publications and books and so forth. The focus of Dr. Durvasula's clinical, academic, and consultative work is the etiology and impact of narcissism and high conflict, entitled, antagonistic personality styles on human relationships, mental health, and societal expectations. Her work's been featured on Red Table Talk, The Today Show, Oxygen Bravo, and she's a featured expert on the digital media mental health platform MedCircle. Dr. Durvasula's research on personality disorders has been funded by the National Institute of Health, and she's a consulting editor of the scientific journal Behavioral Medicine, and is just making a huge, huge impact on the world and on the lives of real people. On her website, Dr-Ramani, RAMANI.com, and most importantly on your YouTube channel, which is just filled with every type of video on every aspect of relating to, interacting with, living with, not living with, leaving, parenting with, all of the things that we do in our daily lives with someone who has narcissistic qualities. So
well, I appreciate that. Thank you. As I always feel like that's a grandiose introduction, and last thing I want to be in what I do is grandiose, but thank you. And it's an honor to talk to somebody who works in this field as well. So I appreciate it.
I mean, it was so fun when we finally kind of met sort of, just that kindred spirit, because as you know, Wendy Beharry and I have a group, Co-Parenting with a Narcissist, which is just the most beautiful, touching, painful gathering of parents. And but there aren't a lot of people who specialize. In fact, Wendy was not available a couple of years ago, and I reached out to just a few people in the field, and you were unavailable for scheduling issues, but there were a few who said, I don't know what to tell parents. They just they can diagnose it, they can discuss it, they can theorize about it, but the pragmatic, how do you live with someone or co-parent after a separation when you still have children in common?
Mm-hmm. It's so challenging, Susan, because at some level, to do this work realistically, you really feel like an executioner. The news is largely bad, and I have to say that I feel ethically my role is to really sort of maintain rather realistic expectations for what a person is going to go through, not only sort of how stormy this journey is going to be, but that this will impact their children. And I think, to me, the hardest part of the parenting work is the damned if you do, damned if you don't of it all. If they stay in the relationship, then the children witness this, really this contemptuous, at times even abusive marriage between two parents, which can leave them with very sort of distorted constructs of not only what human relationships and marriage or close relationships are about, but also the anxiety that comes from living in a house that's so fraught with tension. But so many parents struggle with this idea of, I don't want to lose my children 20, 30, 40, or 50% of the time. At least if I'm under the same roof as them, I can be a source of solace and comfort for them. And then on the flip side is that people say, well, I don't want them to witness this, so they leave, because it really does become untenable. And then all the tensions that come with that. And I have to say that the destination that the vast majority of children who have to survive these kinds of narcissistic sorts of co-parenting or marital situations their parents are in is anxiety, severe lifelong anxiety. And I tell the parents, I've got to prepare you for this. And I think what really is tragic, that is in that smaller segment of cases, if I were to spitball a number, somewhere to 10 to 20%, where their children in adulthood go on to have those narcissistic patterns and traits themselves, which is its own form of devastation. So,
Yeah.
and then there's a whole smattering of the other issues. Like I think that children who grow up in these situations also have issues around self-regulation, which can manifest in things like substance use issues, eating issues or eating disorder, gambling, like social media obsessiveness, like an obsessiveness that's used as a self-regulation, having grown up in such a dysregulated environment.
So not to bum anybody out, because I know that that's a lot to take in at the beginning of this conversation, I'm going to also play the part of Pollyanna and not undo anything you've said, because you're a realist and you're setting realistic expectations. And thankfully, there are things that we can do.
Yes.
Things we can do to mitigate the likelihood of those things happening. And that's what, Wendy and I see every month when we work with parents, that we see positive movement. We see improvement in not only their well-being, the co-parent, the healthier parent, but also in their children. And a big part of that rests on how we both accept, come to terms with. When you and I were talking recently, we talked about the grief.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge piece to accept this is the situation.
Yes, yes,
Begging, discussing, sending your partner articles about the damage being done to the children is not helpful. So I love that you're so clear. Let's start with give up on all that. And what can we do as a parent to reduce the likelihood of your kids experiencing some, anxiety or taking into their adult life some of the remnants or the residue of what they experienced as a child? And there are things that parents can do. So I want to talk about that. But first, I want to sort of help people know, well, is this what I'm dealing with? So can you just talk about some of the classic indications or predictable behaviors that point to the possibility that one's co-parent is a narcissist, and what that even is?
I mean, it's things like lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, somebody who's quite controlling, superficial, validation and admiration seeking, deeply sensitive to any form of criticism or feedback. We see things like impulsivity, and all of this is cloaking this sense of inadequacy and insecurity, that these are the defensive projections that a narcissistic person has to protect that core inadequacy. And when that inadequacy gets triggered or activated, then that narcissistic person usually then has their shame come up, and right behind that shame is often a lot of rage. But we can't forget the vulnerable presentation of narcissism, which is characterized by a sense of victimhood, of sullenness, resentfulness, often more of an introversion, whereas a classical grandiose narcissist is quite extroverted. The vulnerable narcissist tends to be quite introverted. We tend to see more social anxiety there. We tend to see more of a woe is me, kind of a sad sack, hangdog, life was never fair to me, nothing ever goes my way. And partners in those relationships often find themselves constantly babysitting the narcissistic person's vulnerability, constantly having to provide reassurance to the point of sheer exhaustion, and often almost kind of enabling it. Like, what can I do? Who can I call? Let's do this. I'll get my parents to loan us money. Like, it's constantly trying to prop them up. Nothing is ever enough. And if you look at the work of people like Pincus and Ronningstam, the real sort of theoretical heavy hitters in the world of narcissism, Ronningstam in particular, she would argue that vulnerable and grandiose narcissism are just two faces of the same coin. And when things are going badly for the narcissistic person, we tend to see more of the victimhood, sullenness, and resentfulness. And then when things are going well for them, we see sort of that pretentious, arrogant, preening kind of narcissistic presentation. And mixed into this are the patterns like dismissiveness, invalidation, minimization, lots of manipulation, gaslighting. All of these patterns just tend to be part of the narcissistic relationship. So it's constantly unsettling, it's constantly invalidating, it's constantly unsupportive, but tossed in here, and that's what gets confusing, are what I call the bits of sunshine. Those days where you're like, I really like this person, we're having the best time, we have good sex, this person is so smart, they're my favorite Scrabble buddy, we both love this obscure hobby. There's something compelling about this person. It's that compellingness that often can lead to the justification that makes these relationships last often decades past what would be considered a healthy shelf life.
I'm really happy that you moved in that direction, because I often say that they give good crumbs.
Mm-hmm.
You never know when you're going to get a little dose of something, but it's a good dose. And so we sort of stand there hovering on the side, hoping that maybe today or maybe at this meal, we're going to get tossed a little scrap. And there is a process inside of us that has to shift first. And the good news is there are things we can do. Now, we cannot ever change that person. And as I said before, looking at the grieving, it's actually quite liberating when you accept, oh, this is what it is. And this isn't going to change. But there's a lot that a parent can do independent of, preventing some of the fallout and the pain of what the family will be going through. But there's a lot a parent can do independent of what the narcissistic co-parent does. Can we talk about that? Some of the ways to empower a parent to not be as vulnerable, as sucked in, as desperate for that promise of, or that idea of hope that this time is going to be different.
Right. Part of it is education, right? So I always say there's sort of 5 things that keep people stuck in narcissistic relationships. The hope it's going to get better and it's going to change. The fear of the unknown. What if I get divorced? If I don't have my kids half the time? What is the money going to be? How am I going to fit into society? The guilt, especially when you're dealing with a vulnerable narcissistic presentation. I hate to say it, but these folks almost look pathetic. And you feel guilty leaving this person who just can't get it together. And you're like, I'm not convinced this person could tie their shoes unless I was helping them. So there's almost a sort of strange sort of caregiving guilt that comes in. Familiarity. A lot of people get into narcissistic marriages because they grew up in homes like this. And there's an almost magnetic draw, like that repetition compulsion that Freud and others wrote about, that this idea that this is familiar. So people feel like, I just keep getting pulled back in. It's like the mafia, right? I keep trying to get out, keep pulling me back in. And then finally, and this is what I'm about to talk about, is lack of information. The vast majority of therapists aren't even well versed in narcissism. I can count on one hand the number of graduate programs I'm aware of that require a course in personality disorders, let alone one focused solely on these high conflict antagonistic personality disorders, which are actually the bane of most clinicians' existence, which to me is such an interesting kind of an oversight. So most clients don't get it. And then they're stumbling around in the dark and might put search terms into Google and be thrown to my videos or your podcast or something. They're like, oh, this is a thing. This isn't just me in this situation. And I think just understanding patterns like trauma bonding, like radical acceptance, that this isn't really going to change. So I can have realistic expectations if I do this and do that. And I can really understand that there's limits to this. That actually does set some people free from some of the tyranny, because they're saying, okay, I'm no longer trying to do the impossible. I can focus on the possible. And it's really about teaching people what the possible is. One thing that's very interesting about narcissistic relationships and co-parenting is not all narcissistic people are bad parents.
Yes.
Some of them are on point. Actually, they get supply from their kids, which may not be a great thing to do, but they're really into their kids. They can have sort of a Disneyland parent kind of feel or flair, but they're actually into their kids. And I say to people, if you're going to have to co-parent, and I think people are hurt, they don't have a partner in this person, right? They feel betrayed. And especially when there's situations like infidelity and all of that, there's even a bitterness of how does this person get to portray being the great parent to the world, and they betrayed me. I'm like, we're having 2 different conversations here. That idea of you having a healthy marriage, that train left the station a long time ago. However, what's remaining on the table is the opportunity for this person to do right by these kids. And if this person is rolling up and trying to be present with these kids and show off and be super parent, run with the ball. Like, and let them be the super parent. Use that as your day to go take a break and take a nap, and you do you, and let them brag about being super parent. If your kids are safe and they're having a good time, and actually that parent isn't doing a bad job, be glad with that. And I think that kind of ego, kind of stuckness can sometimes throw people off, is that support their parenting. If you're in that, and that's actually not an unfortunate situation. I understand there's a lot of grief around marriage not working, but there can be that part of them being able to be a successful parent, maybe in just small doses. And yes, it may only be the Disneyland parent. And if that's the case, that you have to be the kind of the more of the unpleasant, do your homework, eat your vegetables parent, so be it. but take those Disneyland moments that they take them off to the beach or whatever, and use those as moments to replenish yourself. It really means shifting the paradigm, that it's not going to be the kind of maybe fantasy vision you had of family life. The other thing I teach people is the power of the word and. Trauma bonding and cognitive dissonance all come from a place of the but. They're yelling, but they had a bad day. They're not showing empathy, but they had a rough parent. But. I said, if you want to push through the trauma bond, push through the dissonance, push through the justification, I want you to throw your butts out and bring in the ands. I am married to this person and they're really mean to me. I am married to this person and they have no empathy for me. You might wonder why, because now you have to sit with that. And sitting with that dissonance, instead of trying to make it go away, can actually make you more agentic and being able to take more clear steps forward, whether that means marital dissolution, whether that means trying to figure out the workarounds, whatever it may be. I think those are huge steps. And then finally, I do say to parents, like, something to keep in mind is there's things any parent can do under these conditions, which is routine, consistency, empathy, compassion. And I say the best way to teach the child reciprocity, play board games with them, and sometimes you win. I remember, this wasn't my story, but I remember being with kids and playing a game, and it was like Chutes and Ladders, and I won, and the child became upset. And this friend was like, why didn't you just let them win? I said, because I want her to be with the disappointment and learn to regulate that disappointment of the Chutes and Ladders game. Those moments, there's so many moments to teach empathy, literally from almost the age of 2 all the way to early adulthood, whether it's board games, whether it's watching a TV show or a movie or reading a storybook and talking about them afterwards. So I do think that the helplessness can be allayed by the myriad things a parent can do to give their child a solid grounding. Because frankly, Susan, I have seen so many cases of people who had one narcissistic parent and one really solid parent. They turn out to be really solid adults with really the only monkey on their back being anxiety and a feeling of not being good enough. But if anything, it created a neurosis around imposter syndrome and all of that. But they're really highly functioning adults who actually go on to really successful adult relationships and aspirations. So I don't view this as sort of a sentence, but I do think that parents have to remind themselves, even if they're co-parenting with a narcissist, you have to grieve the idea that you've got a partner in this, that you're doing this on your own, and there's a lot you do on your own.
Oh boy, that's great, because I'm all about both the education and the training, which is why I'm in the business I'm in and why you're in the business. I mean, this is what we're trying to magnify our message as loudly and widely as we can, because it is a turning point, I think, societally, for people to start to take a step back and go, this doesn't feel right. Maybe it isn't right. Maybe I'm actually barking up the wrong tree, as they used to say. So training and education, but also that there are things that we can do as a stable, healthy parent. Often the parent that the child's like, God, you're so controlling. You're so mean. Dad, mom lets me do whatever I want. Why can't I have more screen time? You're so uptight. And we sort of have to kind of live with that. And hopefully we have outside resources, friends, therapists, support groups to kind of process through that. Because it's certainly not our child's job to sort of behave a particular way so we feel better. And that is a dangerous path, I know. And it's tempting because there's so much of an overlay of injustice about the situation and unfairness. And it can trigger our own childhood stuff. Like maybe as a child, we had a similar dynamic going on. However, there is hope. And I agree with you. I've seen many kids emerge from childhoods where there was a narcissistic parent who became very empathic, very caring and solid. And yes, and I agree. I think anxiety is probably the primary overlay. So before we wrap up, which I can't believe we already are nearing the end of this, I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can foster an easier dynamic. And maybe that means let's talk about what a parent should not do or is not in their best interest when they're communicating with a narcissistic co-parent. or of course, if you have suggestions on what you can do to ensure a greater successful, the texting, all the different ways that communication can fall apart very quickly if we poke the bear. So how do we avoid poking the bear?
Again, it is to don't poke the bear. And I think that what happens is that let's assume that these are divorced parents, right? Who are not parenting. Because I think it's two different conversations. So let's start with you're no longer married to this person and you're doing it in separate households. It's like the old Dragnet show, right? Just the facts. You stick to you are no longer working through this marriage. You do not bring up the cheating incident. You do not bring up the lying incident. No, this is about the children. I use the term in a lot of my trainings and seminars and all that, this idea of true north. When you're dealing with a narcissist, you've got to have a true north. And by that true north, I mean, the only time you're willing to go to the mattresses, the only time you're willing to take the fight. So some people I'll say to them, there's no reason to talk about XYZ, ABC, PDQ, you name it. However, your kids may be your true north. You may be willing to take the battle, take the bait, really communicate clearly, knowing it's going to be an ugly ending, but at least you'll know I got it down to say, such and such, they need to go to this doctor. You might fight for them to get therapy. You might fight for them to go to a different school, and the other parent is fighting. I've seen numerous people have to really go to the deepest, darkest fights to get their children into therapy. And I'm like, this fight is worthy. We're going to keep helping you push through it. The majority of time it landed the way they wanted. Sometimes it didn't. But I said, other fights not worth it. This fight, your child needs mental health services, worth it. Okay, so that's what I mean by a true north. But it's really sticking to the facts and not getting lost in the thickets of what happened, or your new girlfriend this and your new girlfriend that. Like there's a lot of that kind of egoistic sniping. Let it go. Facts, like that. Pretend you're in a deposition. Do it in writing. To the degree you're in a case that you are having to go back and rewrite settlement agreements and rewrite custody and parenting plans and all that, you do need that in writing. And again, there are the parenting apps that are done in a way that, that they're much more tracked. They're available by mediators and custody evaluators and all of that. Like look into, there's a whole bunch of different ones out there. I'm not going to advocate for one or the other, but, to get to, many times that's actually a stipulation of things like mediation and all of that anyhow. So you may need to use something like that. But it is really keeping it to the facts. I don't know if you're familiar with Tina Swithin's work. Tina, One Mom's Battle. Tina's a friend of mine, and Tina talks about yellow rocking. And I always thought that that's such an interesting usage. And, it gets away from the gray rocking, which really feels super disengaged, right? And it's almost so flat that it's destabilizing for a child, potentially to see two gray rocked parents. But the yellow rocking allows you to infuse a little bit more empathic emotion in there. I see you got a new car. It looks, now instead of like, I see you got a new car, hey, I got a new car. I like the color, or, whatever neutral topic you can find to talk about that can at least create for the child the sense that this is this really fraught, hostile kind of a space. So that's in the case of marital dissolution. Now, in the parents who are still together, who are saying like, listen, for now, I don't feel comfortable leaving this marriage, but I have to co-parent with this. The rules are kind of similar. True north and just the facts. This is about your kids. Like, this is really no longer probably going to be a particularly rewarding or particularly deep, intimate relationship. There's a term, actually, a client threw at me, and then I developed it out, this idea of firewalling. And if you have a firewall on your computer or on a computer network, it's a way of monitoring the information that comes in and that goes out of your computer, so people aren't stealing your passwords or giving you a virus and all of that. That's how I suggest people communicate with narcissists, is through firewalls. You do not want to share anything that is going to start a new argument, that's going to leave you vulnerable. I always say with narcissists, don't share the good news, don't share the bad news, just share the superficial news, and only share the other news to the degree you need to, because otherwise you're just going to froth up a fight. And on the receiving side of it, don't take the bait. They're always trying to poke you. Don't take the bait. That's a gray rocking premise. And then again, a lot of things in writing, putting things like, here it is in writing. And I know that sounds so legalistic, but if this marriage is actually starting to head for the rocks, those emails, those text messages end up becoming a really important part of the record. Will it go anywhere for you? Who the heck knows? But at least you've got it. But put things in writing. But I always say with a narcissistic parent, going back to this idea of a true north, if something matters to your child and that narcissistic parent is notoriously inconsistent or doesn't follow through, what you don't want is your child losing out on an opportunity by you assuming that that narcissistic parent is going to perform, get the application in on time, whatever. This is where I'm saying that when you're parenting, when you're co-parenting with a narcissistic co-parent, you're basically a single parent with an elephant on your back. You know, you're having to do all the hard work of single parenting with a person in your house who's antagonizing you. But when something's high stakes, true north, you've got to step up and do that for your child. And does that mean you're doing the disproportionate labor? Yeah, it does. And it's not fair, and life's not fair.
Powerful, important. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, okay, everyone. We're here to serve. I mean, I think that this is the purpose of this podcast and all the work that we're both doing in our respective fields and businesses and platforms. And the serve means is because you all deserve support. You deserve information. You deserve help. And I think it also starts with acknowledging for each one of you listening that you are doing the hard work. Mm-hmm. And we honor that this is a difficult path. There is no way around it. That is just how it is. And I love, this idea that I know when I had my son, and I'm, 5'4.5". I'm not a huge woman. My son is now 6'5". I was in labor for 27 hours and he was 9.5 pounds. And I knew that I couldn't do it. And then I did anyway. And I think that when we can remember the things we've done that seemed impossible, it can really fortify us. And so every one of you, remember the things you have accomplished, because it's so easy to start to kind of keep track of all the things that have fallen apart, or the ways that this life that you're, as you raise your kids doesn't match what you envisioned. But look for the ways that it does. Look for the little gems, the little kernels of hope or that positivity that kind of prop you up and make you realize, yes, I can do this really difficult thing. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything you want to add, Ramani?
I think that there's so much grief. I want to go back to that word grief, because this idea, the grief around the unfairness, the grief around the injustice, the grief around some people who, for example, may have had their own divorced parents vow, come hell or high water, I don't want to get divorced. And yet you may find yourself having to navigate those waters. The grief of knowing your children had to witness an unhappy marriage rather than the vision you may have had for them, which was one filled with love and joy. The grief that you didn't have a happy marriage. Like, there's so much grief. Then I remind people, grief is like these waves, especially when it comes to narcissistic abuse, and nobody's dead. It's these waves that come up on the sand, and that it will hit you at the most random times. You'll see a family happily having dinner in a restaurant near you, and the grief will hit you like as though somebody punched you in the chest, and it's okay. And even if you need to step away to the restroom and cry it out in a stall for a minute, it's okay. So many have been there with you. So many more will. You're not crazy. You're not losing your mind. This is a grief like no other. Nobody quite gets it unless they go through it. And I really want to reassure people that if you're grieving and you're finding yourself crying at the most random things, that means you're doing it just right. And trust your psyche. Like it's sort of like off gassing. It's letting some of that toxic stuff go, and just be there, be present. This is co-parenting with a narcissist is a masterclass in mindfulness, because you have to learn to be there and mindfully with your kids, despite all of this distress happening in your life, and be very present and work around the problem, and really then have to let go of all of your old narrative. You're writing a very different kind of story.
Yeah, but you can do it.
You can do it. You can do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ramani. Can you please remind people of what you're doing and how they can find you?
Yeah, please come on over to the YouTube channel, join us, subscribe to the channel. We put out new content every day. And so we always welcome suggestions. In fact, I think some of our best videos actually came from viewer suggestions, and that led to me researching and doing a deeper dive into a topic. And so, I mean, really, please know that this is This is me having the pleasure of researching issues and then bringing them almost in a crowdsourced way. So please do join us. And if you hit the, again, hit that little bell, you'll get notified every day when that new video comes out. Please also check out my website, drramani.com. It's spell out the DOCTOR, Ramani.com. On that website, it's really a compendium of everything related to narcissistic relationships, other people's content, podcasts I've appeared on, things like, we'll have a link to this, to our podcast today, appearances, seminars. We do seminars about once a month, and these are ticketed seminars where people can do a deeper dive into a topic and really explore it more. And then, and on there, you'll find information about my books and all of that stuff too. You can even go to other sites like MedCircle, where I do regular interviews with them if you're interested in that. So you can find me lots of places and talking about this in lots of different ways. So I do hope people, if they're looking for information, I consider the YouTube channel to be really almost like a real library, if you will.
Yes, yes. The image I have of you is like, you're like a crusader.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah, a non-violent crusader.
Non-violent crusader.
I didn't think it was going to get here. And I think for me, the devastation was that there were so many people out there where there was no answer. And I have to be frank with you, and I can say this to you as a fellow mental health practitioner, I'm angry at the field. Yeah. I'm angry at the field for being unwilling to address this. It's a very uncomfortable thing to address, but just because something makes us uncomfortable doesn't mean that all the years we spent in school and getting training, I do feel that there's a necessity, because the number of people I've seen sort of set free from the voices in their head telling them that they're no good and this is their fault and that they're to blame, that it was simple information that actually for a lot of people helped set them free. And so for me, another big part of my so-called crusade really is to train therapists, to really come up with training models to teach them, like, this is what this is how you work with clients who are going through this. And, and everyone's got a different story, yet there's some really universal themes there. So I shall keep crusading until I get too tired, which some days.
And this is the thing, that one of the first books that I read as I was starting to do the deep dive is The Wizard of Oz and Other Narcissists. Yeah. And of course, then Wendy Beharry's book, Surviving and Thriving. What is it? Disarming the Narcissist, Surviving and Thriving with the Self-Absorbed. But when I read The Wizard of Oz, it was such an illumination, because I've been a therapist for a long time, and it talked about how these people show up in an office, and therapists have a very difficult time spotting a narcissist. They're charming, they're successful, they have friends, they appear to have kind of life together. So yes, I'm so glad that you're putting some attention into training the therapists as well, mental health professionals. Okay, everyone. My website, as you probably know, is susanstiffelman.com. And as I mentioned, Wendy Beharry and I have a monthly support group called Co-Parenting with a Narcissist, and we get right down in the trenches. It's a beautiful gathering. So if you need that kind of ongoing support, it's not very expensive, and we welcome new people to join us. Ramani, thank you. And I look forward to continuing to watch your crusade and to helping however I can to bring this training and education to so many who need it.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.